The morning mist hung heavy over Milan as Urbano Monti adjusted his spectacles and spread the enormous planisphere across his oak table. The year was 1615, and at 73 years of age, the renowned cartographer had spent the better part of 5 decades mapping the known world. Yet today, his weathered hands trembled not from age, but from the weight of what he was about to record, testimonies that would challenge every principle of natural philosophy he had learned. Monty's workshop occupied the upper floor of his family's palazzo, its tall windows facing east to catch the morning light essential for his meticulous work. Maps covered every wall, some his own creation, others acquired from Venetian merchants who had sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules. But it was not the familiar coastlines of the Mediterranean or the exotic shores of the Indies that occupied his thoughts this particular morning. It was the letter that had arrived 3 days prior from his former apprentice, Francesco Berlingueri, now serving as cartographer aboard a Genoese trading vessel. The letter, written in Francesco's careful script, contained observations that defied rational explanation. Monty had read it a dozen times, each reading adding to his bewilderment. Francesco wrote of creatures encountered during a storm forced landing on an uncharted island somewhere in the vast expanse between Sicily and the coast of Africa. The young cartographer described beings that existed only in the margins of ancient texts and the fevered imaginings of medieval illuminators. Monty rose from his desk and walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling streets below. Merchants hawked their wares, scholars debated in the shadows of the cathedral, and life proceeded with its comfortable predictability. How could he reconcile this ordered world with Francesco's impossible claims? Yet the young man had been his most promising student, trained in the rigorous methods of observation and measurement that Monty himself had learned from the great Mercator's disciples. The testimony began with a description of the storm itself, a tempest so violent that it had driven Francesco's ship far from its intended course to Alexandria. For 3 days, the crew had battled winds that seemed to blow from all directions simultaneously, while waves the size of cathedral spires threatened to swallow their vessel whole. When the storm finally abated, they found themselves in waters unmarked on any chart, with land visible on the horizon. Francesco wrote that the island appeared mountainous and heavily forested, with beaches of black sand that glittered like crushed obsidian. Captain Grimaldi had ordered the ship anchored in a protected bay while repairs were made to the damaged mainmast. A landing party was organized to search for fresh water and timber, with Francesco accompanying them to map the island's coastline. It was during this reconnaissance that the first encounter occurred. Francesco described walking along a cliff path, his surveying instruments in hand, when he heard the rhythmic pounding of what he initially took to be a blacksmith's hammer. Following the sound through a grove of unfamiliar trees bearing golden fruit, he came upon a clearing where a figure labored over an enormous anvil. The being that Francesco observed defied every category of natural philosophy known to learned men. Standing nearly 8 feet in height, it possessed the basic form of a man, but with proportions that spoke of immense physical power. Its shoulders were broad as a door frame, its arms thick as tree trunks, and its hands large enough to grasp a man's head like an apple. But most remarkable of all was its face, or rather, the single enormous eye that dominated its countenance, positioned where a man's nose would be, surrounded by a heavy brow that cast perpetual shadows. The Cyclops, for what else could it be called, worked with tools of impossible size, shaping what appeared to be weapons from metal that glowed with its own inner light. Francesco watched in fascination as the creature lifted a hammer that would have required 4 men to wield, bringing it down upon the anvil with such force that the very ground trembled beneath his feet. Monty paused in his reading to examine the detailed sketch that Francesco had included with his letter. The drawing showed remarkable technical precision, with careful attention to proportion and anatomical detail. This was not the work of an imagination inflamed by too much wine or the delirium of fever. Francesco had observed, measured, and recorded with the same methodical approach Monty had taught him for mapping coastlines and calculating distances. According to Francesco's account, he had remained hidden in the undergrowth for nearly an hour, making careful observations and sketches. The Cyclops worked with surprising delicacy for such a massive creature, etching intricate patterns into the metal objects it shaped. Francesco noted that the being's single eye seemed capable of incredible focus, never blinking as it examined its work from various angles. The young cartographer's fascination might have continued indefinitely had he not accidentally disturbed a branch while adjusting his position for a better view. The sound, barely audible to human ears, caused the Cyclops to cease its work immediately. The great eye turned in Francesco's direction, and, for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and mythical being regarded each other across the clearing. Francesco described the Cyclops' gaze as surprisingly intelligent, lacking the brutish hostility that classical authors had attributed to such creatures. Instead, there was curiosity in that single orb, and perhaps even a trace of sadness. The being set down its hammer and took a step toward Francesco's hiding place, but the young cartographer's nerve finally failed him. He fled through the forest, crashing through undergrowth in his haste to reach the safety of his companions. When Francesco finally reached the beach where his shipmates labored to repair their vessel, he found them in a state of considerable agitation. The ship's carpenter, a practical man named Lorenzo who had sailed the Mediterranean for 30 years, reported his own extraordinary encounter. While searching for suitable timber in the island's interior, Lorenzo had stumbled upon what he initially took to be a group of mounted riders approaching through the trees. The carpenter's description of these beings filled several pages of Francesco's letter, each detail more fantastical than the last. The creatures possessed the torsos of men, but the bodies of horses, standing taller at the shoulder than any earthly steed. Their human portions were powerfully built, with skin bronzed by sun and wind, while their equine bodies displayed coats of various colors, chestnut, bay, and a silver gray that seemed to shimmer in the dappled forest light. Lorenzo had watched from concealment as the centaurs, for such was the only name that could be applied to these beings, conducted what appeared to be a hunting party. They carried spears of unusual design, with heads that gleamed like polished silver, and moved through the forest with a grace that spoke of perfect harmony between their dual natures. Their human faces bore expressions of noble intelligence, while their horse bodies demonstrated strength and speed that surpassed any earthly mount. The carpenter reported that the centaurs moved in formation, clearly following the trail of some unseen prey. Their leader, distinguished by a golden torque around his neck and a mane of silver hair, paused occasionally to examine tracks or broken vegetation. Lorenzo noted that the creature's enhanced senses seemed to extend beyond normal human or equine capabilities. More than once, the centaur leader turned his head toward sounds that the carpenter could not detect. Francesco's letter continued with Lorenzo's account of following the hunting party at a safe distance, his curiosity overcoming his natural caution. The centaurs led him deeper into the island's interior, through groves of trees bearing fruit unlike any known to Mediterranean botanists. The air grew thick with unfamiliar scents, spices that reminded Lorenzo of distant Eastern markets, but with undertones he could not identify. The hunt culminated in a clearing where the centaurs surrounded their prey. Not an animal, as Lorenzo had expected, but something far more extraordinary. Coiled in the center of the clearing was a serpent of enormous proportions, easily 40 feet in length, with scales that reflected the filtered sunlight like polished emeralds. But this was no ordinary reptile, for from its elongated neck rose a head of distinctly draconic appearance, complete with ridged horns and eyes that burned with intelligent malice. The battle that ensued challenged every assumption Lorenzo had held about the natural order. The dragon, for what else could such a creature be called, moved with lightning speed despite its size, its great coils capable of crushing trees as thick as a man's waist. Its breath did not produce the fire that ancient tales described, but rather a noxious vapor that withered vegetation wherever it touched. The centaurs attacked in coordinated waves, their supernatural speed allowing them to dart in and out of the dragon's reach while delivering precise strikes with their silver-tipped spears. Their leader demonstrated tactical brilliance, directing his companions to exploit weaknesses in the creature's defenses while avoiding its most dangerous attacks. Lorenzo watched in amazement as the battle raged for what seemed like hours, but could have been mere minutes. Time itself seemed distorted in that otherworldly clearing. The centaur's spears found their mark repeatedly, drawing dark ichor from the dragon's flanks, while the creature's massive tail swept through the space where attackers had stood moments before. The conclusion of the battle came suddenly. The centaur leader, timing his attack with perfect precision, drove his spear deep into a vulnerable spot behind the dragon's skull. The great serpent convulsed once, its death cry echoing through the forest like the sound of tearing metal, then lay still among the crushed vegetation. Francesco's letter described Lorenzo's hasty retreat as the centaurs began what appeared to be a ritual dismemberment of their fallen prey. The carpenter had no desire to discover what purpose such activities might serve, nor whether the creature's apparent nobility extended to showing mercy to uninvited human observers. Monty set down the letter and rubbed his tired eyes. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across his workshop, and still he had not reached the end of Francesco's remarkable testimony. The young cartographer's account continued with descriptions of other crew members' encounters. The ship's cook who swore he had seen women with the lower bodies of serpents sunning themselves on coastal rocks. The bosun who reported strange lights moving beneath the water that seemed to follow patterns too complex for mere phosphorescence. But it was Francesco's own final encounter that proved most disturbing to Monty's rational mind. On the expedition's last day on the mysterious island, while the ship's repairs were being completed, the young cartographer had ventured inland once more in an attempt to create a proper survey of their temporary refuge. Armed with compass, quadrant, and measuring chain, he had begun the methodical process of mapping the island geography. The work proceeded normally until Francesco reached a promontory that offered commanding views of the island's interior. What he observed from that vantage point challenged not only his understanding of natural history, but his comprehension of the world itself. Spread below him was a settlement, not the crude collection of huts that might be expected from primitive inhabitants, but a city of considerable sophistication. The buildings rose in terraced levels up the slopes of a central hill, their architecture unlike anything Francesco had encountered in his extensive travels. Domes and spires caught the sunlight, while broad avenues radiated outward from a central plaza where fountains sent crystalline sprays high into the air. Gardens cascaded down the hillsides in ordered profusion, and bridges of impossible delicacy spanned the ravines between different quarters of the city. But most remarkable were the inhabitants themselves. From his elevated position, Francesco could observe the daily life of beings that defied classification. Cyclopes like the one he had encountered at the forge moved through the streets alongside centaurs and other creatures that seemed drawn from the pages of Pliny's natural history. Winged beings that might have been harpies or sirens perched on building ledges, while in the central plaza, creatures of even more fantastic description conducted what appeared to be a market. Francesco spent hours observing this impossible city, filling page after page of his journal with detailed notes and sketches. The society below him operated with obvious order and purpose. The Cyclopes seemed to serve as craftsmen and builders, their great strength and single-minded focus well suited to such tasks. The centaurs appeared to function as guards or hunters, patrolling the city's perimeter and organizing expeditions into the surrounding wilderness. Most intriguing were the apparent leaders of this society, beings that combined human intelligence with forms that transcended mortal limitations. Francesco described figures that seemed to shift between different aspects, sometimes appearing fully human, other times revealing characteristics of the various mythical races that made up their subjects. These shapeshifters moved through the city with obvious authority, their very presence causing other creatures to step aside in respect. The young cartographer's observations were interrupted by the sound of his captain's horn, calling all hands back to the ship. With great reluctance, Francesco gathered his instruments and began the trek back to the beach. But as he prepared to leave his observation post, movement in the city below caught his attention. A group of the shape-shifting leaders had gathered in the central plaza, their forms now clearly visible as they stood apart from the crowd. One of them, tall, imposing, with features that seemed to shift between human and something altogether more majestic, raised what appeared to be a staff or scepter toward Francesco's position. Even at that great distance, the young cartographer felt the weight of the being's attention, as if those alien eyes could see not just his physical form, but into the very depths of his soul. Francesco described a moment of connection that transcended normal human experience. Without words, without gestures beyond that raised staff, the being below communicated concepts that the young cartographer struggled to put into words. He understood that his presence had been known from the moment he set foot on the island, that his observations had been permitted rather than simply undetected, and that he was being granted a gift of knowledge that carried with it enormous responsibility. The communication lasted only seconds, but Francesco felt fundamentally changed by the experience. As he hurried back toward the ship, his mind reeled with implications that threatened to overwhelm his carefully ordered understanding of reality. The world he thought he knew, bounded by the teachings of Aristotle and the observations of Ptolemy, had revealed itself to be vastly larger and more mysterious than any scholar had dared imagine. Monty's hands shook as he read Francesco's description of the journey back to their ship. The young cartographer reported that the return voyage passed as if in a dream. Fair winds filled their sails from the moment they left the mysterious island's harbor, and their navigation proved uncannily accurate despite the lack of familiar landmarks. It was as if unseen forces were guiding them back toward the established shipping lanes of the Mediterranean. Within 3 days, they had encountered other vessels, and Captain Grimaldi was able to determine their position relative to known coastlines. They had somehow traveled hundreds of miles in the space of a single night's sailing, though Francesco's careful log showed that only normal time had passed according to their shipboard instruments. The letter's final pages contained Francesco's struggle to come to terms with what he had witnessed. As a man of learning, trained in the rigorous methods of scientific observation, he found himself confronting experiences that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. Yet, as a cartographer, he felt obligated to record what he had seen with the same precision he would apply to mapping any newly discovered coastline. Francesco concluded his account with a philosophical reflection that revealed the depth of his dilemma. If such creatures truly existed in hidden corners of the world, what did that mean for humanity's understanding of its place in creation? Were these beings remnants of an ancient world that predated human civilization, or were they inhabitants of a parallel realm that occasionally intersected with the mortal sphere? The young cartographer posed questions that had no easy answers. If cyclopes and centaurs possessed intelligence equal or superior to human beings, what right did mankind have to claim dominion over the natural world? If creatures of such power and wisdom existed beyond the boundaries of known geography, what other assumptions about the limits of the possible might prove equally false? Monty set down the letter and walked once again to his window. The streets of Milan continued their familiar rhythms, but now he saw them differently. Every map on his walls, every carefully plotted coastline and measured distance, represented only a fraction of what might exist beyond the edges of human knowledge. The comfortable certainty of his ordered world had been shattered by Francesco's testimony, leaving him to grapple with possibilities that both thrilled and terrified him. For weeks after receiving the letter, Monty found himself unable to concentrate on his usual work. Commissions from wealthy merchants seeking accurate charts lay unfinished on his desk, while his mind wrestled with the implications of Francesco's discoveries. He began researching ancient texts, seeking references to similar encounters in the works of classical authors. What he found both corroborated and deepened the mystery. Pliny's natural history contained dozens of references to creatures that matched Francesco's descriptions, but these had always been dismissed as the products of overwrought imagination or imperfect translation. Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid described encounters with beings of supernatural power, but scholars had long interpreted these as allegorical rather than literal accounts. Yet Monty began to notice patterns in these ancient testimonies, geographical references that pointed to specific regions of the Mediterranean, seasonal variations that suggested regular migration routes, and behavioral descriptions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of creature habits and customs. Perhaps these classical authors had not been creating fiction, but recording genuine encounters that later generations had chosen to explain away as myth. The cartographer's research led him to other sources, medieval bestiaries that contained remarkably consistent descriptions of mythical beings, travelers' accounts from the margins of Islamic and Byzantine sources, and even contemporary reports from explorers returning from the New World. Christopher Columbus himself had written of mermaids observed near Hispaniola, while Francisco Pizarro's chroniclers described winged serpents in the mountains of Peru. Monty began to perceive the outlines of a vast conspiracy of silence. Not malicious, but born of humanity's need to maintain the illusion of understanding and control over the natural world. Scholars dismissed inconvenient testimonies as folklore, mapmakers omitted islands that appeared on no official charts, and church authorities discouraged speculation about creatures that challenged orthodox teachings about creation. Yet the evidence persisted, hidden in plain sight within the very documents that claimed to debunk it. Monty realized that Francesco's letter was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a continuous stream of encounters that stretched back to the earliest recorded history. The world contained wonders that official knowledge refused to acknowledge, and those brave or foolish enough to witness them were left to carry their burden of impossible truth in isolation. The cartographer's dilemma deepened as he considered his own responsibilities. His reputation had been built on accuracy and reliability, qualities that would not survive the publication of Francesco's account. Yet could he, in good conscience, suppress evidence of such magnitude simply to preserve his professional standing? The very foundations of geographical knowledge might need to be reconsidered if Francesco's observations proved accurate. Monty spent sleepless nights pacing his workshop, alternately convinced of his duty to preserve the truth and terrified of the consequences of revealing it. His health began to suffer from the strain, and his household staff whispered concerns about their master's increasingly erratic behavior. The comfortable certainties that had guided 73 years of life had been swept away by a single letter, leaving him adrift in a sea of impossible possibilities. The solution, when it finally came to him, emerged from his cartographer's training in dealing with uncertain information. Just as he would note unverified reports of new islands or questionable coastline details in the margins of his maps, he could preserve Francesco's testimony without necessarily endorsing its accuracy. The account would be recorded for posterity while allowing future generations to make their own judgments about its veracity. Monty began drafting what he intended as a private memoir, a document that would contain Francesco's letter in its entirety, along with his own research into similar accounts from historical sources. He worked in secret during the early morning hours, before his assistants arrived, carefully documenting each piece of evidence he had uncovered. The memoir grew beyond his initial intentions, as Monty discovered additional sources that seemed to corroborate Francesco's observations. A Venetian merchant's journal from the previous century contained descriptions of an island inhabited by men with the bodies of horses encountered during a storm-force landing. A Byzantine chronicle mentioned trading expeditions that regularly visited ports inhabited by the one-eyed race in exchange for worked metals of impossible beauty and strength. Even more intriguing were the nautical charts that Monti found in the archives of various Italian cities. Maps that showed islands in positions that did not correspond to any known geographical features, marked with cryptic symbols and warnings in multiple languages. These charts appear to be genuine navigational aids rather than decorative fantasies, suggesting that some mariners possessed knowledge of routes and destinations that were carefully concealed from general knowledge. Monti's investigation revealed what appeared to be an informal network of individuals who possessed information about these hidden aspects of the world. See captains who could guide their ships to islands that appeared on no official chart, scholars who maintained private libraries of heretical natural philosophy, and craftsmen who worked with materials that possessed properties unknown to orthodox science. The cartographer realized that Francesco's letter had inducted him into this shadow community of knowledge keepers, individuals who carried the burden of truth that mainstream society refused to acknowledge. The responsibility was both exhilarating and crushing, to know that the world contained wonders beyond imagination while being unable to share that knowledge openly without risking professional and personal destruction. As his private memoir neared completion, Monti faced a final decision about its ultimate fate. He could seal the document away, trusting that future generations might prove more receptive to its revelations. Alternatively, he could attempt to find others who might benefit from Francesco's testimony, individuals whose own experiences had prepared them to accept such impossible truths. The choice was made for him by another letter, this one from a colleague in Venice who had heard rumors of Monti's research into unusual geographical phenomena. Giovanni Battista Museo, compiler of the great collection of travel narratives known as Navigazioni e Viaggi, wrote to inquire whether Monti possessed any accounts that might be suitable for inclusion in future volumes. Ramusio's letter revealed that he too had encountered reports that challenged conventional understanding of world geography. Explorers returning from distant lands brought tales of creatures and civilizations that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of natural history. Like Monti, Ramusio struggled with the question of how to preserve such testimonies without undermining the credibility of more conventional geographical knowledge. The correspondence that developed between the two scholars created a forum for discussing questions that could not be addressed in public academic discourse. Through carefully coded language and oblique references, they shared information about the hidden aspects of world geography that their official positions required them to ignore or suppress. Monti's memoir found its intended audience in this small circle of scholars who possessed both the intellectual courage to consider impossible possibilities and the professional discretion to avoid premature disclosure. Francesco's testimony joined a growing collection of similar accounts, each one adding to a composite picture of a world far stranger and more wonderful than orthodox knowledge dared acknowledge. The document that Monti finally completed represented more than a simple transcription of Francesco's letter. It had evolved into a comprehensive examination of the evidence for mythical creatures in contemporary geographical exploration, drawing connections between ancient texts and modern observations that suggested continuity rather than discontinuity in human encounters with the supernatural. Monti's analysis went beyond mere compilation of testimonies to propose theoretical frameworks for understanding how such creatures might exist within the natural order. Perhaps they inhabited dimensions that occasionally intersected with normal reality or dwelled in regions of the world that were protected by forces beyond human comprehension. The cartographer speculated that human expansion into previously unexplored territories might be increasing the frequency of such encounters, forcing both species to adapt to unprecedented levels of contact. The memoir concluded with Monti's reflection on the responsibility that came with such knowledge. Those privileged to witness or record encounters with mythical beings became guardians of truths that could reshape humanity's understanding of its place in creation. Yet the same knowledge that expanded consciousness also imposed isolation, separating the initiated from mainstream society through barriers of disbelief and incredulity. Monti sealed his completed memoir in a cedar chest along with Francesco's original letter and supporting documents he had gathered during months of research. The chest was hidden in a secret compartment within his workshop, protected by mechanisms that would reveal its contents only to individuals who possess specific knowledge of its location and operating procedures. The cartographer lived another 12 years after completing his secret memoir, during which time he received occasional communications from Francesco and other members of the informal network of truth keepers. The young explorer continued his voyages throughout the Mediterranean, gradually mapping the locations of islands and coastal regions where encounters with mythical beings occurred with relative frequency. These subsequent letters revealed that Francesco's initial experience had been merely an introduction to a hidden world of ongoing contact between human and supernatural civilizations. Trade relationships existed between certain Italian merchant families and communities of Cyclopes who produced metalwork of unparalleled quality. Centaur herds followed migration routes that intersected with established shipping lanes at predictable intervals, creating opportunities for carefully planned encounters. Most remarkably, Francesco reported that some of these mythical beings had expressed interest in learning more about human civilization. A few Centaur scholars had mastered written Latin and carried on philosophical correspondence with sympathetic human intellectuals. Cyclopes craftsmen studied human architectural techniques while teaching selected artisans metallurgical secrets that dated back to the classical era. These revelations suggested that the boundary between human and mythical realms was far more permeable than either side had traditionally assumed. Individuals from both communities who possessed sufficient curiosity and courage could establish relationships that transcended the barriers of species and legend. Yet such contacts required careful discretion to avoid triggering hostile reactions from populations unprepared for such revelations. Monti's final years were spent in quiet contemplation of the implications of his hidden knowledge. The comfort and certainty of his earlier worldview had been permanently altered by Francesco's testimony, replaced by an awareness of mystery and wonder that both enriched and complicated every aspect of his existence. He died peacefully in his workshop in 1613, surrounded by maps that showed only the surface features of a world he knew to contain depths beyond imagination. The cedar chest remained undisturbed in its hiding place for more than 2 centuries, its contents preserved by the dry conditions of Monti's sealed workshop. When the palazzo was finally renovated in the early 19th century, workers discovered the hidden compartment and its remarkable contents. By that time, the Age of Enlightenment had created an intellectual climate even less receptive to claims of supernatural encounters than had existed in Monti's era. The memoir and accompanying documents were transferred to the archives of the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana, where they were cataloged as curiosities of historical interest rather than serious geographical documents. Scholars who examined Monti's work dismissed it as evidence of the cartographer's declining mental faculties in his final years, unable to conceive that such a methodical and precise observer might have recorded literal rather than imaginary encounters. Yet Monti's memoir continued to find readers among individuals whose own experiences had prepared them to recognize its significance. The document circulated quietly among researchers investigating unexplained phenomena, explorers venturing into remote regions where ancient boundaries between worlds might still be permeable, and scholars brave enough to consider possibilities excluded by orthodox academic discourse. Francesco Berlinghieri's original letter, preserved in its entirety within Monti's memoir, remained one of the most detailed and credible accounts of encounters with mythical beings ever recorded by a trained observer. The young cartographer's careful attention to detail, his systematic approach to documentation, and his obvious struggle to reconcile extraordinary observations with conventional understanding created a testimony that transcended the boundaries between scientific reporting and mythological narrative. The questions raised by Monty's memoir continued to challenge readers across the centuries. What if the creatures of myth and legend had never truly disappeared from the world, but had simply learned to avoid contact with increasingly populous and technologically advanced human civilizations? What if the boundaries between possible and impossible were far more flexible than modern science assumed? And what if individuals brave enough to venture beyond the edges of conventional knowledge might still encounter wonders that could transform their understanding of reality itself? These questions remained unanswered as Monty's memoir joined the ranks of documents that preserved impossible truths for generations not yet ready to accept them. The cartographer's legacy lived on in the careful preservation of testimony that might someday contribute to humanity's expanded understanding of the world's hidden depths and the creatures that dwelt within them. In the meantime, his work served as a beacon for those who refused to accept the limitations that orthodox knowledge imposed on the possibilities of existence, and as a reminder that the world's true boundaries lay far beyond the edges of any map that human hands had yet drawn. The discovery of Monty's hidden memoir in 1823 coincided with a period of renewed interest in unexplained phenomena that swept across Europe like an intellectual fever. The Romantic movement had challenged the rigid rationalism of the Enlightenment, creating space for wonder and mystery that had been systematically excluded from academic discourse. Within this transformed intellectual climate, scholars began to reconsider testimonies that previous generations had dismissed as superstition or fantasy. Professor Alessandro Volta, the Younger, nephew of the famous physicist and himself a scholar of natural philosophy at the University of Pavia, became one of the first serious researchers to examine Monty's memoir with scientific rigor. Volta approached the document not as a curious relic of bygone superstition, but as a potentially valuable source of empirical data that deserved systematic investigation. Volta's initial skepticism gave way to fascination as he delved deeper into Monty's carefully preserved archive. The professor discovered that the cartographer had maintained correspondence with nearly a dozen individuals across Europe who claimed similar encounters with mythical beings. These letters, written in various languages and spanning several decades, revealed a pattern of observations that suggested far more than isolated delusions or fabrications. Among the most compelling correspondence was Captain Henrik Ibsen of Bergen, who reported regular sightings of sea serpents along the Norwegian coast that displayed intelligence and social organization unlike any known marine life. Ibsen's logs contained detailed observations of these creatures' behavior, including what appeared to be complex communication systems and seasonal migration patterns that followed astronomical rather than purely environmental cycles. Another significant correspondent was Dr. Wilhelm Paracelsus von Zimmern, a physician practicing in the alpine regions of Bavaria, who documented encounters with beings he termed Bergeister, mountain spirits that possessed human-like intelligence, but dwelt within the very substance of rocky peaks. Von Zimmern's medical training had equipped him with skills in anatomical observation that proved invaluable when describing the physiology of creatures that defied conventional biological classification. Perhaps most remarkable was the correspondence with Sister Margherita di Montefalco, an abbess whose convent occupied a remote valley in the Umbrian Apennines. Sister Margherita wrote of dragons that visited her community regularly, not as the destructive monsters of popular legend, but as ancient beings possessed of wisdom that predated Christian theology. These creatures, she claimed, had served as guardians of sacred knowledge since time immemorial, protecting libraries and treasures that mortal minds were not yet prepared to comprehend. Volta's research into these various testimonies revealed geographical patterns that suggested a hidden infrastructure of contact between human and mythical civilizations. Encounters seemed to cluster around specific types of terrain, isolated islands, remote mountain valleys, and coastal regions where geological conditions created natural barriers to casual exploration. The professor began to theorize that these locations might serve as portal zones where different dimensions of reality intersected. The Bavarian scholar's work gained credibility when he successfully predicted the location of a previously unknown encounter based on his analysis of Monty's geographical data. Following descriptions in Sister Margarita's letters, Volta organized an expedition to a valley near Norcia that the abbess had identified as a regular gathering place for various mythical species. The expedition, undertaken in the autumn of 1825, yielded observations that validated both Monty's methods and his conclusions. Volta's party consisted of 3 carefully selected companions. Professor Ernst Haeckel, a naturalist from the University of Jena, renowned for his systematic approach to biological classification. Dr. Marie Curie de Lavoisier, one of the few women permitted to practice natural philosophy in academic circles, whose expertise in chemistry had proven essential for analyzing unusual mineral samples. And Captain James Ross, a veteran Arctic explorer whose experience in extreme environments would prove invaluable should they encounter hostile conditions. The valley that Sister Margarita had described lay hidden behind a series of false ridges that had concealed it from casual observation for centuries. Access required following a pilgrim trail that appeared to serve no particular shrine or religious site, winding through terrain that seemed designed to discourage exploration by all but the most determined travelers. The path itself showed evidence of ancient construction, with stone markers that bore symbols predating any known alphabetic system. As Volta's party descended into the valley proper, they encountered their first evidence of non-human habitation in the form of structures that challenged architectural understanding. Buildings seemed to grow from the valley walls themselves, their surfaces indistinguishable from natural rock, except for doorways and windows that revealed deliberate design. The construction techniques defied analysis. Massive stone blocks fitted together without mortar, yet sealed so precisely that moisture could not penetrate the joints. The expedition established their base camp near a grove of ancient olive trees that showed signs of careful cultivation despite the absence of any visible agricultural implements. Professor Haeckel noted that the trees themselves displayed characteristics that differed from any known Mediterranean varieties, with leaves that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of observation, and fruit that remained fresh far longer than natural preservation methods could explain. On their second morning in the valley, Dr. Curie de Lavoisier made the discovery that would transform their understanding of the region's significance. While collecting water samples from a stream that flowed through the valley's center, she observed that the liquid displayed properties that violated fundamental principles of chemistry. The water maintained consistent temperature regardless of ambient conditions, showed no signs of bacterial contamination despite the presence of organic matter, and produced crystalline formations when exposed to specific musical frequencies. Captain Ross, meanwhile, had begun mapping the valley's dimensions and discovered that its geography seemed to shift depending on the time of day and season. Landmarks that appeared fixed in position during morning observations had moved significantly by evening, while paths that led to specific destinations one day would terminate in entirely different locations the next. The captain's precise surveying instruments confirmed that these changes were not illusions or measurement errors, but genuine alterations in the valley's physical structure. Professor Haeckel's botanical and zoological surveys revealed an ecosystem that existed outside normal taxonomic classification. Plants displayed characteristics associated with both temperate and tropical climates simultaneously, while insects and small animals seemed to possess intelligence levels far exceeding what their brain structures should have supported. Most remarkably, he observed examples of apparent communication between different species that suggested the presence of an overarching intelligence coordinating the valley's entire biological system. The expedition's first encounter with the valley's mythical inhabitants occurred on their 5th day of exploration. Volta had been examining rock formations that showed evidence of artificial modification when movement in his peripheral vision caused him to freeze in place. Emerging from what had appeared to be solid stone, a figure materialized that matched the descriptions in Sister Margarita's correspondence with perfect accuracy. The dragon that regarded Volta from a distance of perhaps 20 yards stood upright like a man, but stretched nearly 12 feet in height. Its scales reflected the morning sunlight with the brilliance of polished copper, while eyes that burned with inner fire displayed an intelligence that far exceeded human understanding. Most remarkably, the creature showed no signs of hostility or surprise at finding humans in its domain, suggesting that their presence had been anticipated and, perhaps, even invited. Professor Heckel, observing from concealment nearby, noted the dragon's physical characteristics with scientific precision. The creature's anatomy combined reptilian and avian features in ways that challenged evolutionary theory, while its movements demonstrated a grace that spoke of perfect adaptation to both terrestrial and aerial environments. When the dragon spread its wings, an action that seemed intended as greeting rather than threat, their span exceeded 30 feet, yet the membranes appeared delicate as silk despite their obvious strength. The communication that followed challenged every assumption the expedition members held about the nature of language and consciousness. The dragon spoke without words, projecting concepts directly into the minds of its human observers with clarity that surpassed verbal communication. Volta found himself understanding complex philosophical principles that he had struggled with for decades, while simultaneously gaining knowledge about the valley's true nature that no amount of scientific investigation could have revealed. Through this telepathic discourse, the expedition learned that the valley served as a neutral meeting ground where representatives of various mythical species gathered to address issues of mutual concern. The increasing encroachment of human civilization into previously isolated regions had created new challenges that required careful coordination between communities that had maintained independence for millennia. The dragon explained that creatures such as itself had withdrawn from regular contact with humanity not out of hostility, but from recognition that premature revelation of their continued existence would prove disastrous for both species. Human societies lacked the spiritual and intellectual frameworks necessary to accept the reality of beings whose powers exceeded mortal limitations, while mythical communities fear that exposure would lead to exploitation or persecution by those who saw them only as sources of power to be captured and controlled. Yet the dragon also revealed that certain humans possessed the sensitivity and wisdom necessary to serve as intermediaries between the two realms. Individuals such as Sister Margarita, Urbano Mani, and now Volta himself demonstrated the rare combination of intellectual rigor and spiritual openness that allowed them to perceive and interact with mythical beings without losing their essential humanity. Dr. Curie de Lavoisier received permission to analyze samples of the dragon's shed scales, discovering that they contained elements unknown to conventional chemistry. The scales maintained their luminous properties even when separated from their source, suggesting that they channeled forces that existed outside normal electromagnetic spectra. Her careful documentation of these materials would later contribute to theoretical frameworks that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of matter and energy. Captain Ross was granted the extraordinary privilege of observing the valley's dimensional properties from the dragon's aerial perspective. Carried aloft in the creature's powerful claws, he witnessed landscapes that occupied the same geographical coordinates as the valley below, but existed in entirely different phases of reality. Some versions contained crystalline cities that housed civilizations of beings made from living light, while others showed primitive conditions that suggested glimpses into the valley's ancient past. The expedition's week-long stay in the valley provided them with enough material to revolutionize multiple fields of academic study. Professor Heckel's biological specimens included flowers that bloomed only in response to specific emotional states, insects whose wings generated harmonious musical tones, and tree bark that displayed prophetic images when properly prepared. His detailed sketches captured anatomical features that suggested evolutionary pathways completely unknown to contemporary science. Volta's geological observations revealed that the valley's stone formations have been shaped by processes that combine natural forces with conscious intention. The rocks themselves seem to retain memories of their formation, displaying images of the valley's history when touched by individuals possessing appropriate sensitivity. Through these stone chronicles, Volta witnessed the arrival of the first mythical beings in the region, their establishment of the neutral meeting ground, and centuries of careful cultivation that had transformed a simple mountain valley into a sanctuary where impossible beings could gather safely. Perhaps most significantly, the expedition members learned that their visit represented a deliberate test of humanity's readiness to accept expanded concepts of reality. The dragon and other mythical beings had been monitoring human intellectual development for generations, waiting for the emergence of individuals capable of bridging the gap between rational inquiry and mystical experience. The success of Volta's expedition would determine whether further contact between the realms might be possible. The knowledge gained during those 7 days in the hidden valley created profound personal transformations in each expedition member. Professor Haeckel abandoned his previous mechanistic approach to natural history, developing new theoretical frameworks that incorporated consciousness as a fundamental force in biological evolution. Dr. Curie de Lavoisier's chemical research took revolutionary new directions as she explored the properties of matter that existed at the intersection of physical and metaphysical reality. Captain Ross left his career in Arctic exploration to become a cartographer of dimensional boundaries, mapping the locations where mythical realms intersected with ordinary geography. His charts, encoded in symbolic language that concealed their true significance from casual observers, guided future expeditions to locations where contact with otherworldly beings remained possible. Volta himself faced the most challenging transformation, as his experience in the valley had revealed the inadequacy of conventional academic approaches to documenting revolutionary discoveries. The evidence he had gathered could not be presented through normal scholarly channels without risking ridicule and professional destruction, yet the knowledge was too significant to suppress entirely. The solution emerged through collaboration with a growing network of individuals who had experienced similar encounters with mythical beings. Building on the foundation established by Urbano Monti's hidden memoir, these researchers developed alternative methods of preserving and transmitting knowledge that transcended the limitations of orthodox academic discourse. Secret societies formed around the protection and study of mythical encounters, their membership drawn from individuals whose professional qualifications were beyond question, but whose experiences had expanded beyond conventional boundaries. These organizations operated parallel to established academic institutions, maintaining libraries of impossible testimonies, and conducting research projects that official science could not acknowledge. The Società dei Custodi della Verità Nascosta, established in Milan in 1827, became the primary repository for documents related to Monti's research and its subsequent developments. The Society's archives contained not only written accounts, but also physical artifacts that provided tangible evidence of contact between human and mythical civilizations. Dragon scales that retained their luminous properties, centaur-crafted weapons that never dulled or broke, and cyclopes forged metals that displayed impossible strength and flexibility. Membership in such societies required not only evidence of genuine encounter with mythical beings, but also demonstration of absolute discretion in handling sensitive information. Candidates underwent extensive evaluation to ensure they possessed both the intellectual capacity to contribute meaningfully to ongoing research and the emotional stability to bear the burden of impossible knowledge without compromising their effectiveness in conventional society. The Society's research revealed that encounters with mythical beings were increasing in frequency as the 19th century progressed. Industrialization and global exploration were bringing human civilization into contact with previously isolated communities of supernatural creatures, creating unprecedented opportunities for mutual discovery. Yet these same forces also threatened the delicate balance that had allowed mythical beings to maintain their hidden existence for centuries. Railroad construction through remote mountain regions had uncovered dragon lairs that had remained undisturbed since ancient times. Steam-powered vessels could now reach islands that had served as refuges for sea-dwelling mythical species. Telegraph lines transmitted reports of strange encounters across continents within hours, making it increasingly difficult to contain knowledge of supernatural activities within small circles of initiated individuals. The Society's members recognized that they stood at a crucial historical juncture. The old systems of concealment and denial that had protected both human and mythical civilizations were breaking down under pressure from advancing technology and expanding global communication. New frameworks for interaction between the realms needed to be developed before accidental encounters led to conflicts that could prove catastrophic for both sides. Volta's expedition to the Hidden Valley had demonstrated that peaceful cooperation between human and mythical beings was possible when approached with appropriate preparation and respect. The challenge lay in expanding such controlled interactions to create broader understanding while avoiding the chaos that would result from premature public revelation of mythical beings' continued existence. The Society's solution involved the gradual introduction of mythical concepts into human culture through carefully crafted fictional narratives. Authors and artists who had experienced genuine encounters with supernatural beings were encouraged to transform their knowledge into creative works that would familiarize mainstream society with the possibility of such creatures without presenting them as literal reality. This approach proved remarkably successful, as the 19th century witnessed an unprecedented flowering of literature and art featuring mythical beings. Stories of dragons and sea serpents, centaurs, and cyclopes appeared in publications throughout Europe and America, each one contributing to the gradual expansion of human imagination beyond purely rational boundaries. Readers who might have rejected direct claims of supernatural encounters could accept the same concepts when presented as fiction, unconsciously preparing their minds for eventual revelation of deeper truths. The Society's influence extended beyond literature into emerging fields of scientific inquiry that were challenging traditional assumptions about the nature of reality. Spiritualism and psychical research provided frameworks for investigating phenomena that orthodox science could not explain, while archaeology was uncovering evidence of ancient civilizations whose achievements exceeded what conventional historical narratives could account for. Members of the Società dei Custodi della Verità Nascosta found themselves at the forefront of these intellectual developments, contributing insights gained through direct contact with mythical beings to expand human understanding of consciousness, dimensional reality, and the fundamental forces that shaped both physical and metaphysical existence. Their work remained necessarily obscure and indirect, but its influence permeated every aspect of the century's expanding awareness of mystery and possibility. The true measure of their success would come only with future generations, when humanity might prove ready to accept the full reality of the hidden world that existed alongside and within ordinary experience. Until that time arrived, the Society's members carried forward the legacy established by Urbano Monti, preserving impossible truths for those who would eventually possess the wisdom to comprehend and act upon them. The Society's greatest triumph and most profound challenge emerged simultaneously in the person of Dr. Elisabetta Morosini, a Venetian scholar whose unique circumstances had prepared her to serve as a bridge between human and mythical civilizations in ways that previous generations of researchers could never have imagined. Born in 1834 to a family that had maintained secret ties to the supernatural community for over 3 centuries, Elisabetta possessed both the intellectual training necessary for for serious academic work, and the inherited sensitivity that allowed her to perceive mythical beings with unprecedented clarity. The Morosini family's connection to the hidden world traced back to the Renaissance, when an ancestor had served as translator during diplomatic negotiations between the Venetian Republic and a community of sea-dwelling dragons that controlled crucial Mediterranean shipping routes. These creatures, far more ancient and sophisticated than their terrestrial cousins, had established underwater cities that rivaled Venice itself in their architectural magnificence and commercial importance. Dr. Morosini's childhood had been spent learning languages that existed nowhere in orthodox academic curricula. The harmonic speech of water dragons, the gestural communication systems used by centaur herds, and the symbolic writing that cyclopes employed to record their metallurgical knowledge. Her education proceeded in parallel tracks, with conventional tutoring in Latin, mathematics, and natural philosophy, complemented by instruction in mythical customs, dimensional theory, and the delicate protocols required for safe interaction with beings whose power exceeded human comprehension. When Elisabetta reached academic maturity in the 1850s, the situation regarding human mythical relations had become increasingly precarious. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating the pace of global exploration and resource exploitation, bringing human activities into direct conflict with mythical communities that had maintained their isolation for centuries. Steam-powered vessels could now penetrate oceanic depths where dragon cities had remained hidden since antiquity, while mining operations threatened underground networks of caves and tunnels that housed entire civilizations of Earth-dwelling creatures. The crisis came to a head in 1857 when British naval forces, searching for a northwest passage through Arctic waters, encountered a fleet of ice dragons whose territorial claims predated human presence in the region by millennia. The resulting confrontation had been contained only through the intervention of society members who possessed sufficient knowledge of dragon customs to negotiate a temporary truce. Yet it had become clear that such ad hoc solutions could not address the fundamental incompatibility between expanding human civilization and mythical beings' need for secrecy and isolation. Dr. Morosini proposed a radical solution that challenged every assumption about the relationship between human and mythical realms. Instead of maintaining the traditional policy of concealment and limited contact, she advocated for the establishment of formal diplomatic relations that would acknowledge mythical beings as sovereign entities deserving of recognition and respect. Such an approach would require unprecedented levels of cooperation between secret societies and official governments, along with careful preparation of public opinion to accept revelations that would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of its place in the world. The proposal generated fierce debate within the Società dei Custodi della Verità Nascosta and similar organizations across Europe. Conservative members argued that human civilization remained far too immature to handle knowledge of mythical beings' continued existence, pointing to the religious wars and political upheavals that had characterized recent centuries as evidence of humanity's tendency toward destructive fanaticism. Progressive factions countered that concealment was becoming impossible to maintain in an era of rapid technological advancement and global communication, making controlled revelation preferable to chaotic exposure. The debate was resolved by events beyond human control when the American Civil War created conditions that brought mythical beings into direct involvement with human political affairs. Confederate forces, desperate to counter Union industrial advantages, had sought assistance from dragon communities in the Appalachian Mountains, offering territorial concessions in exchange for military support. The resulting alliance had proved decisive in several crucial battles, as dragons' ability to strike from the air with devastating precision provided Confederate armies with capabilities that Union generals could not counter through conventional means. Union forces had responded by seeking their own supernatural allies, discovering that centaur tribes in the Western Territories possessed strategic knowledge about Confederate supply lines and troop movements that conventional reconnaissance could never have obtained. The war that had begun as a purely human conflict evolved into a complex struggle involving multiple species, each pursuing their own interests while nominally supporting one side or the other in the human dispute. Dr. Morosini traveled to America in 1863 as an unofficial representative of European society members, tasked with assessing the implications of open mythical involvement in human warfare. What she discovered exceeded even her most pessimistic projections. The careful balance between secrecy and contact that had been maintained for centuries was collapsing under the pressure of military necessity, creating a situation where mythical beings' existence could no longer be concealed from mainstream human awareness. Yet Elisabetta also observed that American society demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adapting to impossible circumstances. Frontier communities that encountered centaur tribes or dragon flights treated such meetings as unusual but not necessarily threatening events, incorporating supernatural elements into their daily lives with a pragmatism that European societies seemed to lack. The democratic ideals that shaped American political thought provided frameworks for considering the rights and sovereignty of non-human peoples that traditional European monarchical systems could not accommodate. Working with American society members, including the remarkable Clara Barton, who had discovered that certain healing techniques taught by forest-dwelling unicorns far exceeded conventional medical knowledge, Dr. Morosini began developing protocols for systematic revelation of mythical beings' existence. The process would need to proceed gradually, with careful attention to regional and cultural variations in human society's capacity for accepting supernatural realities. The first experimental revelations took place in remote Western territories where human populations were small and already accustomed to encountering unexpected phenomena. Gold prospectors and cattle ranchers proved remarkably adaptable when informed that the creatures they occasionally glimpsed in wilderness areas were ancient inhabitants of a land whose territorial claims predated human settlement by thousands of years. Treaties were negotiated that established protection zones for mythical communities while allowing human economic activities to continue in designated areas. These successes encouraged Dr. Morosini to expand the revelation program to more populated regions, but with careful attention to preparing public opinion through educational initiatives. Universities began offering courses in comparative mythology that introduced students to the possibility that legendary creatures might possess historical reality. Museums displayed artifacts of unknown origin alongside conventional archaeological specimens, encouraging visitors to consider alternative explanations for human civilization's development. The breakthrough came when Dr. Morosini established direct contact with Professor Charles Darwin, whose work on evolutionary theory had created intellectual frameworks capable of accommodating the existence of species that challenge traditional biological classification. Darwin's private correspondence, carefully preserved in society archives, reveals his fascination with the implications of mythical beings for understanding the development of life on Earth. Through careful examination of specimens provided by Dr. Morosini, Darwin discovered that creatures such as dragons and centaurs represented evolutionary pathways that had diverged from human development millions of years earlier. Their abilities, flight, telepathic communication, extended lifespans, reflected adaptations to environmental conditions that human ancestors had never encountered. Yet all species shared common genetic foundations that suggested descent from shared primordial origins. This scientific validation of mythical beings' biological authenticity provided the credibility necessary for Dr. Morosini to approach government officials with formal proposals for diplomatic recognition. The process began with private meetings involving carefully selected individuals who possessed both sufficient intellectual sophistication to comprehend the evidence and adequate political influence to implement policy changes. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's private archives, unsealed only in the 20th century, contain extensive documentation of his negotiations with dragon representatives regarding British mining rights in Wales. The creatures had observed with growing concern the expansion of coal extraction in mountainous regions that had served as their traditional nesting grounds for millennia. Rather than resort to the violent confrontations that had characterized earlier conflicts, the dragons sought negotiated settlements that would protect their essential habitats while allowing human economic activities to continue in less sensitive areas. Similar negotiations proceeded simultaneously across Europe as governments gradually acknowledged that their territories contained populations of non-human citizens whose rights and interests required formal recognition. The process demanded fundamental reconceptualization of legal and political frameworks that had been designed exclusively for human societies, creating new categories of citizenship and sovereignty that could accommodate beings whose nature transcended mortal limitations. Dr. Morosini's role in these developments earned her recognition as the foremost authority on human mythical relations, but also placed her at the center of controversies that threatened to destroy both her professional reputation and her personal safety. Religious authorities denounced her work as heretical, while conservative political factions argued that acknowledging mythical beings' sovereignty would undermine human dominance over the natural world. She received death threats from fanatics who believed that contact with supernatural creatures represented demonic corruption, while simultaneously facing condemnation from mythical communities that viewed any revelation of their existence as betrayal of ancient trust. The assassination attempt came in London in 1871, when Dr. Morosini was attending a conference on advances in anthropological classification. A gunman hired by religious extremists fired 3 shots at close range as she walked between meeting halls. But the attack was thwarted by the intervention of her centaur bodyguard, whose supernatural reflexes allowed him to intercept the bullets with precisely thrown shields. The incident, witnessed by dozens of conventional academics, became the first undeniable public demonstration of mythical beings' continued existence. The revelation's immediate aftermath created the crisis that Dr. Morosini had spent years preparing to manage. Newspaper accounts of the failed assassination spread across Europe within days, accompanied by eyewitness descriptions of the centaur's intervention that could not be dismissed as hallucination or fraud. Religious leaders demanded official investigation of what they termed demonic manifestations, while scientific institutions struggled to incorporate evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Yet the careful groundwork laid by society members over previous decades proved its worth, as public reaction proved far less catastrophic than pessimistic predictions had suggested. University students who had been exposed to comparative mythology courses demonstrated remarkable acceptance of mythical beings' reality, while urban populations that had grown accustomed to technological marvels showed similar adaptability when confronting supernatural phenomena. The formal recognition process accelerated dramatically following the London incident, as governments realized that unofficial acknowledgement was no longer sufficient to manage the complex issues arising from human mythical interaction. The Treaty of Versailles in 1872, not the famous post-war agreement, but a separate document that remained classified until the mid-20th century, established the first international frameworks for mythical beings' diplomatic recognition. Under the treaty's provisions, signatory nations agreed to recognize the territorial sovereignty of established mythical communities within their borders while creating mechanisms for resolving conflicts that arose from competing claims to natural resources. Dragon territories in mountainous regions received protection equivalent to national parks, while oceanic areas claimed by sea-dwelling creatures gained status similar to maritime exclusive economic zones. The treaty also established the International Commission for Mythical Affairs, headquartered in Geneva and staffed by individuals who possessed both conventional diplomatic training and specialized knowledge of supernatural customs and languages. Dr. Morosini was appointed as the Commission's first Director General, a position that required her to navigate the complex political dynamics created by centuries of mutual misunderstanding and suspicion between human and mythical civilizations. Her first major challenge involved mediating a territorial dispute between German mining interests and a community of underground-dwelling dwarfs whose network of tunnels extended throughout the Black Forest region. The creatures possessed detailed knowledge of mineral deposits that human geologists had never suspected, but their mining techniques followed principles that prioritized long-term ecological balance over maximum extraction efficiency. Negotiations required developing new concepts of property rights that could accommodate both human economic needs and mythical beings' commitment to environmental stewardship. The resolution established precedents that would guide future negotiations involving resource conflicts. Human corporations gained access to previously unknown mineral deposits under licensing agreements that required them to employ dwarf advisors and follow extraction procedures that minimized environmental damage. In exchange, the dwarf communities received royalty payments that funded technological improvements to their underground cities while maintaining their traditional commitment to living in harmony with natural systems. Similar agreements were negotiated throughout Europe and America as the revelation of mythical beings' existence created opportunities for unprecedented cooperation between species that had evolved along dramatically different developmental pathways. Centaur tribes contributed their knowledge of agricultural techniques that could increase crop yields while maintaining soil fertility across multiple growing seasons. Dragon metallurgists shared secrets of alloy composition that allowed human engineers to construct buildings and bridges of unprecedented strength and durability. Perhaps most significantly, the formal recognition of mythical beings as legitimate political entities created new approaches to environmental conservation that incorporated both human scientific knowledge and supernatural beings' intuitive understanding of natural systems. Forests that had been scheduled for logging were instead designated as cooperative management zones where human foresters worked alongside tree spirits and woodland creatures to maintain ecological balance while producing sustainable timber yields. These collaborative efforts produced results that exceeded what either human or mythical communities could have achieved working independently. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically in regions where Centaur advisors helped human farmers implement crop rotation schedules that followed astronomical cycles rather than purely economic considerations. Mining operations guided by dwarf expertise proved far more efficient and environmentally responsible than conventional extraction methods. Yet the integration process also created new categories of conflict that required careful management to prevent escalation into violence. Traditional mythical communities struggled to adapt to formal recognition after centuries of maintaining their independence through isolation and secrecy. Some dragon clans rejected any cooperation with human governments, viewing diplomatic treaties as constraints on their ancient sovereignty. Centaur tribes split between progressive factions that welcomed integration opportunities and conservative groups that insisted on maintaining ancestral separation from human civilization. Dr. Morosini's greatest challenge came from within human society itself, as the revelation of mythical beings' existence triggered religious and philosophical crises that threatened to undermine the social foundations of Western civilization. Traditional Christian theology had no frameworks for incorporating creatures that possessed obvious spiritual powers, but fell outside biblical categories of angels, demons, or mortal souls. Islamic and Jewish scholars faced similar challenges in reconciling their understanding of divine creation with evidence of species that seemed to transcend the boundaries between physical and metaphysical existence. The theological debates that emerged from these challenges proved as complex and contentious as the diplomatic negotiations that established formal relations between human and mythical governments. Progressive religious thinkers argued that mythical beings represented aspects of divine creation that human understanding had simply failed to recognize, while conservative factions maintained that such creatures could only be manifestations of evil forces seeking to corrupt human souls. Dr. Morosini found herself serving not only as a diplomatic mediator between different species, but as a theological interpreter who helped religious communities develop new doctrinal frameworks that could accommodate expanded definitions of creation and consciousness. Her work in this area required extensive collaboration with religious scholars from multiple traditions, seeking common ground that could support peaceful coexistence between belief systems that had evolved under very different assumptions about the nature of reality. The synthesis that eventually emerged from these interfaith dialogues represented one of the most significant theological developments since the Protestant Reformation. The Concordat of Sacred Understanding, signed in Rome in 1875 by representatives of major world religions alongside delegates from various mythical communities, established principles for recognizing the spiritual validity of non-human consciousness while maintaining the essential doctrines of each participating faith tradition. Under the Concordat's provisions, mythical beings were acknowledged as possessing souls equivalent to humans, but developing along evolutionary pathways that had resulted in different expressions of spiritual consciousness. Dragons' telepathic abilities and extended lifespans reflected their role as guardians of ancient wisdom, while centaurs' connection to natural rhythms positioned them as intermediaries between civilized societies and the wild forces of creation. This theological recognition proved crucial for ensuring public acceptance of mythical beings' integration into human society. Religious communities that had initially opposed such cooperation began developing new forms of worship and spiritual practice that incorporated insights gained through contact with supernatural consciousness. Mystical traditions within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism found validation for their emphasis on direct spiritual experience, while secular philosophical movements gained new perspectives on the nature of consciousness and reality. The practical implications of these developments extended far beyond academic theology into the everyday lives of ordinary citizens who found themselves living alongside neighbors whose nature challenged every previous assumption about the boundaries of possibility. Children growing up in the post-revelation world developed relationships with mythical playmates that their parents could barely comprehend, while adults struggled to adapt workplace customs and social conventions to accommodate colleagues whose abilities exceeded human limitations. Schools required complete restructuring of curricula to prepare students for a world where magical abilities represented practical skills rather than fantasy entertainment. Mathematics classes included instruction in the geometric principles that govern dimensional portals, while history courses examined the hidden influence that mythical beings had exercised on human civilization throughout recorded time. Literature and art programs explored new forms of creative expression that incorporated supernatural techniques and perspectives. The economic implications proved equally revolutionary as human societies discovered that mythical beings possessed knowledge and abilities that could transform entire industries. Dragon fire, when properly controlled and channeled, provided energy sources that far exceeded coal or wood burning efficiency while producing no harmful emissions. Centaur agricultural advisors helped farmers achieve crop yields that doubled traditional harvests while actually improving soil fertility over time. Cyclops craftsmanship created objects of unprecedented durability and beauty, but their production methods required apprenticeship programs that could train human workers in techniques that combined physical skill with intuitive understanding of metal properties. These educational initiatives created new categories of professional certification and guild membership that recognized competency in both conventional and supernatural manufacturing processes.